Yes, yeah. So, there's been a lot. We had at the start of the Gaza war, the latest Gaza war, we had a couple of episodes where we talked about the laws of armed conflict at a pretty high level, general principles. Um, responded to some listener questions about it, but it was all pretty high level. And I imported some of my more concrete on the ground experience from my time in Iraq, but and what I'd known from talking to some Israeli JAG officers. But I had an opportunity to spend some time on the phone over the weekend with a former Israeli JAG officer, Amos Giara, who now is a professor of law at the University of Utah. And what was his job at one point in the IDF? He was the main guy, the main JAG officer reviewing strikes in Gaza. So the guy knows of what he speaks. And so I thought it would be interesting to provide some general information as the invasion is unfolding, perhaps already started, but as the invasion is unfolding, because a lot of people have wondered, how is it that Israel actually approves strikes? What are the processes? Because as we know, often, your outcomes can be only as good as your processes. And you may say, well, we want to comply with the laws of war. We only want to strike military targets, but you've got to have a process for that. And so, Sarah, what I did is I called him, and he walked through the process, and the process is interesting. So he said substantively something that I've said many times, which is Israel has a very broad reading of the laws of war. In other words, reads them as very broadly applicable. And so it has a very it places rules of engagement in very narrow confines. In other words, a broad reading of the laws of war means a narrow room for maneuver of the actual military forces. They're tightly restricted. He said, but you have to look at things, two different kinds of operations. One that he called counter-terror. That was the phrase that he used. What we would have called in Iraq pre-planned. In other words, we are deliberately plotting and planning to attack this target. And he talked about the process of review. And the process of review required an intelligence committee to come forward, and the intelligence committee comes forward with its evidence in support of the strike. And this has got to be, this is vetted, this intelligence is vetted and evaluated by the JAG officer, looked at from several angles, including not just the quality of the intelligence that's provided, but also what efforts are being taken to minimize civilian casualties, etc. And this is very much like the United States. We wouldn't necessarily have an intelligence committee specifically, but we would have intelligence recommendations that were evaluated by a lawyer, and then the lawyer would consult with the commander. And that's what happens in the IDF as well. And it's ultimately up to the commander. And he said that a lot of what you're seeing underway, a lot of the bombing raids that you're seeing now are these pre-planned strikes. In other words, there's a large number of targets that the IDF has identified, because remember, it's placed Gaza under surveillance for a really long time. So it's got a lot of targets that it identifies, a lot of new targets that emerge. So there's this process of intelligence committee, JAG review, and then command decision. Very similar to the American process. And then I asked him about, well, what happens when the actual ground assault is underway? And he called that, he used a distinction. He called one counter terrorism strikes, and this, he said, was just more like quote unquote war. And the term we use in the U.S. military is TIC, troops in contact. In other words, when troops are actually under fire, the decision-making devolves to the on-scene commander. And in that circumstance, the law of war compliance is really, truly based on the discipline of the soldiers who are immediately responding. What is their training? Because obviously you're not calling a JAG officer when you're under fire and saying, sir, we're receiving incoming from an apartment building. Can we return fire? And if so, with which weapons? Like that. That's not a thing. Here you have to rely on training. And the training is disciplined, focused fire, appropriate weapons to deal with the threat and not greater. And that's a lot to put on young men under fire, young men and young women under fire. But that's what their training does for them. And I contrasted this with the way we responded when under fire in Iraq versus the way the Iraqi army, which was much less well trained, would respond. And we would respond with very focused fire straight at the target. It could be very destructive, but it was very straight at the target. The Iraqi army, when it was under fire, would respond with what we called at the time the death blossom. In other words, they would just start firing in almost every direction indiscriminately, even before they could discern where the incoming rounds were coming from. They would just open up. That's what a poorly disciplined military does, and that causes lots of civilian casualties. A disciplined military engages the target and only the target. And so he was saying once the invasion gets started, then you just see an enormous reliance on the training of the soldiers who are on the ground because they're responding to incoming fire directly. They don't need that JAG officer in the loop. But a lot of what we are seeing, and this is something I hear words like indiscriminate used in connection with the Gaza airstrikes. Number one, if you have any military knowledge at all, you can watch the strikes happen and know they're not indiscriminate. You can see them happen and you realize they're precisely targeted. Doesn't mean that they're precisely targeted at the correct target or that the target should have been chosen, but they're still precisely targeted. But the thing that was really standing out to me was the emphasis that many of these strikes, most of these strikes that you're seeing are pre-planned strikes that have had undertaken as part of them a legal review. And then the other thing, I asked him this because this was my experience. And actually, there's 2/3 of a whole law review laying around somewhere, Sarah, where I had a law review that I was going to write for the JAG school about the difference between IDF and American rules of engagement in urban combat. This was years ago. And my case was that the IDF is much stricter in its rules than the U.S. military. And I asked him this, and he said, without question, the IDF is historically more strict in its application of rules of engagement than the U.S. military. And I just don't even think that's a debatable point. Now, I do think that the IDF is loosening some of those rules of engagement currently, but I still think they're in all likelihood as strict or stricter as than our, there's even stricter than our rules of engagement in comparable circumstances. So that's the results of my conversation.